Okay, well, take care of my duty right now. Okay, everyone, welcome. My name's Maxine Kaufman, and I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of Florida's Gulf Coast, and I welcome you all here. This is just wonderful to have this type of collaboration for this event. I'm going to now give you a little bit of information about our presenter. Dr. Sharon Leader is a professor emerita of English, Women's Studies, and Jewish Studies at SUNY Nassau Community College. She is the author of The Fix, A Father's Secrets, A Daughter's Search. Silver winner Benjamin Franklin IBPA Award, Best New Voice in Fiction of 2018. Co-editor with Milton Teichman of Truth and Lamentation, Stories and Poems on the Holocaust, which was nominated for the National Jewish Book Award in 1994. She is the founder of Creative Outlets, Finding Your Voice Through Arts at Cape Cod Museum of Art. More information can be found at www.sharonleader.com. And now, as I asked before, if you are not, if everyone could please mute their microphone, and we will continue with Sharon.
Thank you, Maxine, and thank you everyone for being here. I want to thank all of my co-sponsors, the Jewish Federation of Florida's Gulf Coast, Temple Ahavat Shalom, Congregation Beth Shalom, and Am Hayam Cape Cod Havurah. And I want to thank everyone who is here from different parts of the country, from New England and Massachusetts and Cape Cod, from the St. Petersburg area and different parts of Florida, and even as far as Colorado, Buffalo, New York, Israel, and Mexico. So welcome to everyone and thank you for being here. Tonight, I wish to discuss the central theme of my book, Three Groundbreaking Jewish Feminists Pursuing Social Justice, and why the women in my study feel the social justice tradition in Judaism is important, and why, by following their example, is it crucial for us at this very moment in history to put the core Jewish universal values that lie behind social justice Judaism to practice. Why should we put them into practice today? In this talk, I will be interspersing readings from my book and interpreting and condensing the book's messages. After my presentation, I hope we will discuss and comment upon the issues that the book raises. First, social justice Jews, like myself, can be found in all branches of Judaism: Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Renewal, and Orthodox. What they have in common is that they all find primary spiritual meaning in relating to human beings, regardless of nation, faith, ethnicity, sex, gender, or class. They are grounded in the belief that all life is sacred and that encounters with human beings should call forth our compassion and sense of justice. There are also social justice Jews who hold these same universalist values, but they do not affiliate with any congregation. Some may be anti-organized religion entirely, or even self-defined agnostics and atheists. I call this kind of Judaism universalistic. One doesn't have to be an observant Jew to be a social justice Jew, but of course, social justice is completely compatible with observance. I selected 3 women to profile, 2 of whom, like myself, became universalist Jews. The Austrian Gerda Lerner, who was born in 1920 and who died in 2013, and the Hungarian Susanna Wald, who was born in 1937 and is now living in Oaxaca, Mexico. But the third woman Ruth W. Messenger, who is still living in New York, where she was born in 1940, was actually raised as a Universalist Jew. I selected these three women because by practicing Universalism, they made a difference in the fields they pursued. Gerda Lerner was a groundbreaker in history by being one of the original founders of the field of women's history, and within that field, Black women's history. It is thanks to her efforts that we are celebrating Women's History Month right now in March. Susanna Wald is a groundbreaker in surrealist art by bringing feminism to the fore of surrealism. That is a movement devoted to freedom from dictatorships, whether on the left or on the right, and a movement dedicated to creativity and love, values that we sorely need today. Wald's art features women not as models or muses for the male imagination, but as vibrant symbols for repairing and healing a wounded world. Ruth W. Messenger, in the first half of her career, was a groundbreaker in New York City politics, being the first woman, a Democrat, to run for mayor of New York City. Though as a politician, she kept her Jewish identity muted. But she became, in the second half of her career, the leading public Jewish voice in global humanitarianism as the president and CEO of the American Jewish World Service. All three women happen to be secular Jews, as I am. They were raised in assimilated households, as I was, but their assimilated households were much more traditionally Jewish than mine was. I was a third-generation Jew born in New York in 1946 to parents who desperately wanted to become Americanized. They sent only my brother to Hebrew school for his bar mitzvah, and they were Jewish mainly around holidays, with family gatherings at the time of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Hanukkah, and Passover. They were not synagogue goers. They were, Kanahara, God bless them, Jewish food preparers and enjoyers. Yet even with this little exposure to Judaism, the social justice messages rang loudly and clearly to my ears, growing up in the era of civil rights, anti-Vietnam War politics, and the women's movement. I'd like to look at the core Jewish universal values that lie behind social justice Judaism. And Maxine was kind enough to make a chart of some of these values. I'm going to stress the first two on this chart, and then you can read for yourselves the others that I've accumulated. They're not a total list of the universal values, but they give you a flavor for the kinds of values behind these three women's lives. The first by Rabbi Hillel, whose life extends from before the Common Era into the time of the 1st century AD. His statement is a model for what can be the ethical life in Judaism. If I am not for myself, then who will be for me? And if I am only for myself, then what am I? And if not now, when? Certainly, these are all important, but for universalism in Judaism, the second principle is the most important. If I am only for myself, then what am I? Certainly, I must develop my strengths and talents to the best of my ability. But if I am not also responsible to community, I'm not really fulfilling a basic message of Judaism, which is that we exist in community and we are responsible for one another. The other value from Exodus, it begins in Exodus, the foundation of the Jewish experience. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. And I've learned from Rabbi Deanna that in Hebrew, the stranger is the ger, and that there are at least 36 mentions of the ger in the Torah. It's a very important principle. Our experience as being marginalized and oppressed in Egypt, and then yearning for our freedom to the promised land. We, as strangers, know that others must be aligned with who are marginalized and oppressed, and that together we can reach freedom. There are others on this list, but I can go to the next screen if possible, Maxine. And I'm going to go to the central point in the center. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. This is the word of the Lord. We learn that neighbor is not a geographical construct, not the one who lives near you, but it's a moral concept that we were created by God to be neighbors of one another. And I think these three can lead us into my talk about the three women. You can just glance at the other concepts. There may be a third screen as well. Tzedakah, 8 levels of tzedakah, and the blessings, recognizing and praising God in everything. We can return to this later if necessary. I'd like to talk about how some of these values relate to the lives of my three profiles. When Gerda Lerner, we'll begin with her, was 14 in 1934 Vienna, she had been trained in an Orthodox synagogue for her bat mitzvah, and she also received instruction from a rabbi in public elementary school during the time devoted to religious instruction for the Christian children. That was when the Social Democrats were in power. Things changed when the anti-Semitic right-wing clerical party took control of Austria in 1934, and Jewish children no longer received Jewish education. Crosses hung in all the classrooms. Then in 1938, the Nazis bloodlessly took over Austria, and Jews were being humiliated on the streets daily. Gerda Lerner wrote in her autobiography, Fireweed, she had to take a position to assert or deny who she was. At first, she identified completely with her congregation. She wrote in her autobiography, we had to stick together because they hated us. We had to stick together because we were surrounded by enemies. We had to show that we were proud of our faith. We had to be good to show that Jews could be good. However, Lerner never did become a bat mitzvah because she became disenchanted with what she viewed to be hypocrisy and injustice within her congregation and within her family. Jews were supposed to show compassion to the poor, but her father wouldn't let her associate with girls from the lower classes, and her congregation did not seat the poor during the high holidays. Moreover, her congregation treated girls and boys differently. Girls and boys were separated during services, and they learned different curricula. There was no Talmud, there was no Mishnah or Midrash for the girls. The girls and boys became bar and bat mitzvah at different ages, 13 for boys, 14 for girls. As a girl, Lerner felt like a second-class citizen. So when it was time for her to become a bat mitzvah, she withdrew from her congregation. She says, by the time I was 14, I became a political person. She joined some young communists at school who were advocating for the poor and working classes. who opposed the fascists because they were sending people on the left and leaders of unions to jail. Lerna herself wound up in jail, being held ransom with her mother because the Nazis couldn't find her father, who in actuality was a bourgeois pharmacist, but ironically, he was being sought on trumped-up charges for being a communist. That prison experience turned Lerna into a Universalist Jew. She says, the hours, days, weeks of my several-month incarceration became the most important events of my life. They gave it a meaning and a shape I have ever since tried to comprehend. The lesson I learned in prison was the one I would stress throughout my feminist scholarship. In order to survive in the Austrian civil prison cell that was built for one, but that I shared at times with 4 others, some of them Jews, some of them social democrats and anti-fascists who were Christian, I could not allow myself to be a victim. Victims didn't survive. They could go mad or be beaten to death or starve and choose their own form of death. But if I wanted to survive, I could not do it alone. And I had to fight with all my strength to keep some sort of social contract. In prison, she formulated the idea that the survival of the marginalized depended upon bonding with others across lines of religion, race, and class. The same theme gained her reputation as a historian after she graduated from Columbia in 1966 and published her major works on women under male domination. Let's fast forward to the Cold War in the United States in the late 1940s and 50s, where Gerda Lerner is now a writer. She was the mother of 2 children, and she was married to a Jewish Hollywood script writer who was blacklisted for being a communist. In this anti-Semitic climate in the United States that often conflated being a Jew with being a communist, as in the execution of the Rosenbergs, Lerner was no longer able to sell her fiction, which was based on her experiences in the Holocaust and also based on race and class in the United States. She enrolled in the New School in New York, majored in history with a focus on women, and wound up getting a doctoral degree at Columbia. Her 3rd book was Black Women in White America in 1972. It was that book that introduced me to Gerda Lerner. I was a traveling teacher throughout New England, helping mainly Black and Latina students, mainly women, earn bachelor's degrees to keep their jobs in hospitals and nursing homes as paraprofessionals, and I used Black Women in White America. Again, Gerda Lerner was labeled an outlier. She was no longer writing about Jews, and she was writing about Blacks without being Black. So she was practicing universalism in Judaism. She was extending her reach to others who were being marginalized. She gave her clearest explanation of her universalist approach to the mother-in-law of her Black neighbor when she was living in the interracial neighborhood of St. Albans, Queens. She was explaining to the mother-in-law of her friend and neighbor, a Black woman named Sarah. She says, I wrote about Black women because I'm Jewish and because I am a refugee from Hitler. Yeah, Sarah told me that. I'm sorry to hear that. I haven't had much contact with Jewish people, so I can't understand. Well, you've lived in the Jim Crow South. You've been excluded from public restrooms, restaurants, trains. So to me, any kind of discrimination is evil. I can't stand it. I want my children free of it. That gives you a taste of Gerda Lerner and her universalism. I'd like to move for a moment to Susanna Wald. Susanna Wald was a refugee to Argentina from Stalin-controlled Hungary after World War II. And she became a surrealist artist in Chile after entering a second marriage to a well-known surrealist poet and artist in Santiago. Her Jewish identification was very different from Gerda Lerner's, in that she developed a Jewish spiritual inner self that served as a sacred place, a kind of protective hiding place, away from the brutality and terror of the world she witnessed around her. Her entire family would have been annihilated when the Nazis occupied Budapest in 1944, had it not been for two factors. By chance, her mother befriended a sympathetic priest who converted her family to Catholicism. And secondly, later, the Swedish rescuer Raoul Wallenberg saved the entire family by providing them with documents, safe documents, and a tiny room in one of the safe houses he arranged in the city. From the window of that tiny room, Wald witnessed as an 8-year-old atrocities and killings that made her imagine she could die at any moment, and that her survival was nothing short of miraculous. Conversion to Catholicism became one of several masks or protective shields that she wore over her lifetime to hide the Jewish core that she knew from childhood was noble and important, but could cost her her life. So what she did was repress all of the Jewish memories that she had from that childhood. She repressed her mother lighting candles for the dead. She repressed her mother fasting on Yom Kippur. She repressed her father being proud of being a Kohen and reciting in Hebrew from the Torah in the synagogue. She repressed sitting with her aunts in the section for women behind the mechitza. She repressed all of that. And she wore these masks. First, the mask of Catholicism. She experienced her Jewish spiritual center as the most precious and endangered part of her being, and she repressed it and only expressed in very coded fashion what her Jewish experience was in her surrealist art. She abandoned Catholicism as a young adult in Argentina because its dogma restricted her artistic yearnings, and she assumed the mantle of surrealism, which was a movement in art that elevated the importance of the subconscious over the domination of reason. The unleashing of the unconscious allowed Susanna Wald to dig into her repressed memories. But these repressed memories only manifested in unusual ways that encoded Jewish messages. And I have to say here that I am interpreting Susanna Wald's art as encoding Jewish messages, because after interviewing her over the course of 5 years, I believe she was not able to declare her Jewishness until the very end of her life. So let's look at some of these encoded messages. Wald read in Jungian psychology about the history and evolution of the female archetype that was called by Jung the Great Mother. And she found in the evolution of the female archetype the source of the Hebrew Shekhinah, the divine dwelling among the people. And unusually, she found the origin of the Shekhinah in ancient Sumeria, being written love poems to by the high priestess of the moon god, whose name was Enheduanna. Enheduanna was a high priestess the daughter of the great Sumerian ruler Sargon, and she wrote love poems to the goddess Inanna. And maybe we could have these images of Susanna Wald's egg paintings. I believe that Susanna Wald embedded the original source of the Shekhinah in a series of eggs. The eggs became very important to her as a symbol of womanhood. And also, if we look at the very first image on the left, it's called Enheduanna's Message. And in that egg, which is in the center, that egg surrounded by masks, you see the image of a woman bending in an arc with a circular face. And it is as if she has a kind of veil hanging from the back of her head. That image is Inanna. We find that image of Inanna in all the Sumerian archaeological findings. And Enheduanna's message is that Inanna is the divine living in both creation and destruction. She visits the world, the underworld, and comes back bringing all the skulls with her. She is the source of everything, the first belief in a unitary, powerful goddess. And we find the evolution of the egg in Susanna's paintings. In the next painting, this is called Full Moon. The egg is representing the moon. And I ask us to think of how the moon registers in our practice of Judaism today. Do women also gather as the pagan women did around the moon? Do we have our Rosh Chodesh meetings in which the moon is figured? And we move to the figure on the right of the egg on the table with the wine and the formal mat for our dinner, the egg which accompanies every Seder plate, the egg which symbolizes on our Seder plate the destruction of the Second Temple, which we mourn, and then rebirth and continuity. And I must read to you, how does Susanna Wald think about the egg? The symbol that is most frequent in her art is the egg. The image of the egg comes to her, she told one of her biographers, in visions, sometimes in daydreams, sometimes inserted into things apparently unrelated or while falling asleep. She says she doesn't know exactly why she paints them, but conjectures that they relate to the collective unconscious and the archetype of the Great Mother. She says also, they come from a very deep stratum. They are more a manifestation of something of which I am unaware. Well, she has repressed many of her Jewish images so far deeply and hasn't really uncovered them until the very end of her life. She says also that her daughter was married to a Jewish man in Toronto whose parents were observant and held Seders regularly each spring for Passover. Wald, who maintains now dual residency in Mexico and Canada, still joins her daughter and her daughter's former in-laws for the Seders. But she admitted to me that her in-laws are very uncomfortable with how clumsily she observes the traditional Jewish ritual. Finally, after many years of repressing her Jewish core, Wald felt impelled publicly to declare her Jewishness in 2006 in Oaxaca, Mexico, during the Great Insurrection there. The insurrection attempted to take power away from an oppressive political regime and grant rights to indigenous people farm workers, unions, and teachers. It was the most widespread insurrection in Oaxaca's modern history. And at that insurrection, she was asked to speak to a gathering of 300 people because she was known as an artist. What she said was, "I noticed that I was persecuted myself. My phone line was tapped and people disappeared. This affected me in ways beyond reason. I searched for some explanation. I found it in the cloud of terror my elders experienced in face of events during the Second World War that I lived under and which I could not understand as a child. I stated something to the effect that I was concerned about the persecutions that I was witnessing, saying that I had also been persecuted because of my being Jewish. For most of my life, I don't want to lie when I'm asked if I'm Jewish, and I don't want to tell the truth. In 2006, I finally come out by reading in a public event in Oaxaca an essay about the repression of indigenous peoples. I then say that I know the feeling because I also have been persecuted for being Jewish. Yet the person leading the event finds that I should not have done that. He's trying to protect me, just as the Catholic priest did in Budapest when he converted me to Catholicism. In Mexico, probably the most xenophobic country I ever lived in, being Jewish could be a handicap. I think you know a little bit now about the life of Susanna Wald. I'd like to talk a bit now about Ruth Messenger. Ruth Messenger grew up in New York on the Upper West Side, and her mother was the public relations director of the Jewish Theological Seminary, just at the time that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel joined the faculty to bring the universalist perspective in Judaism to the curriculum and the community. One of his major works on the prophets shows how social justice is one of the primary messages and concerns in Judaism. Ruth worked side by side with her mother as a young girl, as her mother edited copy of Rabbi Heschel's that she brought home to work on. This immersion in Heschel's work influenced Ruth Messenger her entire life. Ruth Messenger spent her first career as a social worker and New York City politician in the years 1960s through the 1990s, practicing universalism all along, but not articulating the Jewish origins of her values. For example, in the 1960s, she started the Children's Community Workshop School on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It was a fully integrated school, racially and economically, with no tracking. All the students took all the classes together. It was a precursor of the charter schools. One of Ruth Messenger's heroes was conservative Rabbi Joachim Prince, who joined the Martin Luther King Jr. rally March for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. Ruth was proud to tell me that Rabbi Prince used the command and commitment to love thy neighbor to stress our collective responsibility as Jews to preserve the dignity and integrity of every human being. Rabbi Prince saw the fight against Nazism and the fight against racial injustice as morally the same cause. He was a refugee from Hitler, and this made its mark on Ruth's thinking. Her thinking turned into her grandest opportunity when she took the helm of the American Jewish World Service in the late 1990s. She became the leader who expanded American Jewish World Service and applied the universal values of Judaism to that project. She reflected on 18 years of leadership of American Jewish World Service and said that she attributed her activism to Rabbi Heschel. She referred to Heschel's often quoted concept about responsibility. In a free society where terrible wrongs exist, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Messenger said this ethic of Heschel's motivated the work I did in the 60s and motivates me in American Jewish World Service. She continued to say in her own biography, I didn't cause urban racism or bad schools. I didn't cause land theft in Guatemala, but I'm still responsible for it. And she goes on to say, in some cases, the problems that exist in the world were created by the US government. And in other cases, we are responsible purely because we are human and we are citizens of the world. Either way, as a Jew, I have to act. I have to assume responsibility for things that aren't the way they ought to be. And I have to work to create greater justice. In 2008, she organized and brought to the world's attention American Jewish World Service by organizing the Save the Darfur campaign, which was a response to the genocide of Black Africans in the Darfur region of Sudan. And she did that by referencing the Jewish experience of the Holocaust. And that brought world attention to the American Jewish World Service. She articulated her vision for American Jewish World Service in her own words, and I think they are the best to explain what it accomplished. In a volume called I Am Jewish, she wrote, as a Jew, I am working with grassroots groups in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, Russia, and Ukraine, feeding the hungry, caring for the stranger, and defeating the oppressions that plague so many. And I envision a day when service by Jews in a Jewish context will become a rite of passage in and for the Jewish community. It will be done by people of all ages, from teens to seniors, and involve work with Jews and non-Jews. We will make a dramatic difference in attracting Jews to more active Judaism, changing the ways in which Jews are seen around the world, and changing the ways in which Jews understand their global obligation. Now, why do I think universalism is a relevant and crucial message for Jews today? Following in the legacy of Ruth Messenger, who's still alive and well. In the period during which I composed this book, tribalism has increased worldwide. Today, more than 70 million refugees are displaced victims of tribal conflicts and persecution in their home countries. Millions live in overcrowded camps that can hardly be called shelters without adequate nutrition, healthcare, or sanitation. Most countries in the Northern Hemisphere, where millions of refugees seek asylum, have been closed to asylum seekers due to exclusionary, ultra-nationalistic politics, another form of tribalism. Northern Hemisphere ultra-nationalistic ideologies target such groups as Muslims, Kurds, Central Americans, Mexicans, and Caribbeans, among others, as unwanted, undesirable. It is this book's contention that the universal values inherent in Jewish tradition can contribute to attitudes we must develop and connections we must nurture with other cultures globally, so that people of different backgrounds understand, appreciate, and respect the multiplicity of traditions We all have a human right to believe and practice. The women I have written about have embodied this hope, and I'm hoping that we can bring this message forward, even in our local Jewish communities, as best we can. So I end my talk now, and I hope I've given you insight into these women and perhaps an interest in following in more detail in the book. But I'd like to open this up to comments and questions and for us to discuss the issues that this book raises. Thank you, Yael. Thank you.
Well, I have a question. So the artist from Oaxaca, Suzanne Wall, I know the insurrection 2006, what did she feel that this would change everything? That she could now admit she was Jewish?
Yeah, she felt that she was obligated. Something inside her told her that she must share her experience of persecution. She felt that she could inspire those who were organizing, those who were demonstrating. She felt she could inspire them that by bonding together, they could change conditions in their city and in their state and in their country. That insurrection came just at the time when the president of Mexico was being decided as well. And she was hoping for a complete overhaul from the oppressive regimes of the past to more democratically sensitive regimes. The short thing that she tried to accomplish was better conditions for the agrarian workers and teachers, but she wanted to inspire them. And she felt that by sharing her own experience, she could do that.
So how was she treated subsequently?
She got a radio program. She got a column in a newspaper. The insurrection did not achieve the promise that it had hoped. It was settled and certain things felt, but she became a voice in the community. However, as I mentioned, Mexico is a very xenophobic country. It also has embedded a lot of anti-Semitism. And so she was still quite nervous that her coming out as a Jew might hurt her. It hasn't, because she has made her home in Oaxaca, and she has now been more comfortable being recognized as a Jewish woman, as well as a Spanish-speaking, what can I say, a Spanish-speaking immigrant to Mexico. As a South American, Argentinian, and Chilean, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you?
I just stopped the screen share so we could see everyone's faces if they had a question.
Oh, okay. Well, just that she feels much more comfortable and whole in herself, having come out as a Jewish woman. But
Right.
she's still feeling under assault, possibly, as a Jewish person.
Thank you.
I know one question did come up in someone who was communicating to me about this book, and not just to someone, but a woman in our community who is known, Ann Handel, read the book. And Ann Handel was active in American Jewish World Service for many, many years. And her experiences are also recounted in my book. And it's thanks to Ann that I got my insights into what happened in the countries around the world where American Jewish World Service sent volunteers. But Anne said after reading this book, the Holocaust plays such a role in this impulse towards universalism. What will happen to social justice Judaism when the Holocaust survivors have gone? Will there still be a social justice tradition in Judaism when the Holocaust has receded from our minds and hearts?
Sharon, I raised that question with somebody and they said the youth of today are motivated. So that I didn't need to worry because the youth
Mhm.
were inclined towards social justice. I hope that is true.
Sharon, it's Deb. Can I ask it's more an observation that you may find odd, but two of the women, the first two women you spoke of, one was about to have a bat mitzvah at age 14 and decided not to. And another, I thought that her mother got to speak from the Bima and read from the Torah. Am I right about that?
Her father.
Oh, her father.
Father.
I thought you said her mother, which would have been very unusual. Even having a bat mitzvah, as much as she decided against it, would have been quite unusual. So I'm wondering if, in some ways, even though she rejected it, that experience gave her some power. Or, I never knew anyone who had a bat mitzvah, and I'm a lot younger than that. So I just thought that was interesting. Anyway, it's all very interesting. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, just about Gerda Lerner, she was really very well grounded in Jewish learning. And she wrote, in fact, a very huge tome called The Creation of Patriarchy, in which she documents the formation of the Hebrew people. And it's a very, very interesting book which reflects all of her knowledge about the history of Judaism. But she felt that, and she was critiqued for this, that to identify just as a Jewish historian would have narrowed her focus. She wanted a broader focus than that.
Thank you.
There's a question from Beth and Larry. If you need to unmute Beth and Larry. We can't hear you.
Okay.
Does that come through now?
Yes,
Great. I wanted to express appreciation, and I'm sure Beth would as well, to Sharon for the immense energy that she's given to this project, not only the research, but the promotion of it, and now taking the show on the road, which is a very exciting point. I think this is doubly valuable to me because the political situation in which she's writing and to which she's speaking is so negative and so virulent, and the denigration of people for religious or other grounds has been unchallenged and sort of run away over the last several years. So this is just to thank Sharon now and to wish her well as she promotes this in her dealings around the country.
thank you, Larry. I hope this is a stepping stone, and I think it is relevant to today because we've just survived a period when tribalism was part of our own US history. And I think that we're hoping to move beyond that now.
Deanna, you can unmute.
I had no idea that Ruth Messenger had founded American Jewish World Service. It's a remarkable organization. And a lot of us want to contribute to help around the world and not only in Jewish milieu. And the wonderful thing about the American Jewish World Service is that it goes everywhere around the world, in small towns and villages, in cities, everywhere. And it's a wonderful way for us to feel connected to the world and not only to the Jewish community. So thank you for bringing her.
Thank you, Rabbi Deanna, for mentioning that. Just one thing, Ruth did inherit an organization that was in existence, but it was seeking new leadership. And so
Okay.
it was she who actually put it in the forefront of the Jewish community's mind.
Mhm.
It wasn't as well established, and she brought funding to it, she brought following to it, and she expanded it in terms of its Jewish messages. Well, another question I have, if other people are raising their hands, is it important to identify oneself as Jewish as we engage in Tikkun Olam? You know, is this the right time for us to be doing this, to be noticeable for where our values come from?
Can I answer that? I think that I think that if we don't, we're in big trouble. I think that it's really the reverse of the question, that if we don't do that, then we give in to the evil parts of our society. And I think we can identify as being Jewish, and we can also identify as being universalist, because when you talk about the theme of universalism, it makes me think of Martin Luther King. It makes me think of leaders of the United Nations. And, you know, that goes back to Heschel. Well, there he was with King. So I think we have to be universalists, and we have to be Jews with our own traditions at the same time. And universalism certainly is not a theme for all Jews. It's for some, but that doesn't matter.
I wanted to say that when I posed the main issue of this book, which is, can we be Jewish and universalist at the same time? Can we be for the Jewish people and for other non-Jewish strangers in need? Ruth Messenger's answer to this, being trained in a sense by Heschel, is that in Judaism, particularism exists to teach universalism. That was her view. You know, one could find a thread and make a valid point that universalism is part and parcel, is integral to all of Judaism. But of course, that is her perspective.
Deborah Kaufman has a question. You need to unmute though, Deborah.
Did I do that?
Now you did.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Sharon. I'm so very pleased that I'm able to, I'm in excruciating pain tonight. I have a very bad back, so I've just been able to come in and out, but it's so good to see you and to hear you talk about your book, which I know quite intimately. I just wanted to refer to the particularism and universalism issue. Certainly from the moment of the giving of the Torah and the Ten Commandments, the whole notion, of course, was that we were to be a light unto other nations. So it is actually written into our history, into our spiritual and theological history as well, that we are, of course, universal. That is sort of the point. of being chosen. And that is the way many would interpret that issue. One of the most important, um, sorry, I'm on a lot of painkiller. Um, one of the most important citations that I have used in my own writing is from one of my dearest persons, Ellen Willis, who died many years ago. And Ellen wrote in the preface to her book after she had been to Israel. Ellen was a very secular Jew, and what she was talking about at the time was that our mission is to act where the particular and the universal meet. And that has always been a guidance for me. So, and it's very clear in your book as well, Sharon. So thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for making that point. Just want to acknowledge that Deborah Kaufman was generous enough to write the foreword to this book. And I appreciate very much the way she placed it in the context of post-Holocaust Jewish identity. And I think your point is very well taken, Deborah, that we are seen to be a light among the nations. And I want to stress that Ruth Messenger interpreted that message in a way that takes any taint of Jewish superiority out of that message. And she reinterprets chosenness in a way that I found was very profound. She writes, embracing chosenness means accepting a moral mandate to speak for and with those whose dignity has been denied. Jews have to come out publicly when others are treated unfairly, despite the taint we may invoke upon ourselves. Being Jewish means choosing to root our lives in ethical obligations. It means figuring out how to negotiate the dynamics of being different and advocating for those who also are perceived as different, especially when the act of doing so renders us vulnerable too. So chosenness becomes part of universalism, as you suggest, Debbie. And one of the volunteers in American Jewish World Service says, we are not a light unto the nations, but we are a light among the nations. And that was what Ruth Messenger had in mind by sending volunteers around the world.
I think we have a question from Renata Wasserman.
Yes. Hi, I just want to point out to all of you that we here on Cape Cod are actually the experience of Judaism and Universalism, how they come together. Because almost 30 years ago, when I first came here, very few people knew any Jews. Jews were not active in any particular organizations. And over the 30 years, the population has changed and has grown, and we have become very active in many different organizations, including the Knesset Interfaith Association, which is all churches, Christian organizations, and Am Hayam. And we created quite a big footprint for the little organization that we are. So this is, to me, how Universalism and Judaism come together very clearly, right here on Cape Cod.
Milton, go ahead and you need to unmute. We lost him.
Oh,
Milton, unmute. You just changed your picture.
maybe I should go and help him. I'll excuse myself so that he could have a voice. Excuse me. Can you unmute? No. No. No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Good. Sharon, I wanted to say that one of the values of your book, among many, for me, is that it puts a fresh light on the term, the very familiar term, secular Jews. Too often, we think of the secular Jew as unconnected to Judaism or indifferent to Judaism. And we fail to see that there are many secular Jews, not only the three you talk about, but secular Jews we have known who are very passionate about their Judaism and express it through values they have acquired from earlier periods in their lives and even in the present. So I think that you're offering something very helpful in assisting us to broaden the conception of the secular Jew and not to think of him or her in such a negative point of view. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Milton. I will mention that in Deborah Kaufman's foreword, she points out that in one recent Pew survey, a good percentage of Jews identify as Jews not by religion, but they see themselves thoroughly as Jewish.
I think you want to, you might need to raise your hand or something like that.
Bob Nelson.
Thanks, Sharon. It's wonderful to hear you and wonderful to follow your train of thought about these three women. It's just something occurred to me that people who have gone through suffering, especially having to do with race or ethnicity, whether you're a Jew or Black or something else, can develop empathy for others. And I'm just wondering how in your own thinking, you incorporate the, if you like, universal talent or capability of empathy into your notion of universalism and of secular Jews basing themselves not necessarily on Judaism, but on their empathetic feelings. For example, we talked about Wald. She was able to express her Judaism in the context of the persecutions going on in Oaxaca. There she found that she had the empathy to feel for those who are being persecuted at that particular point. And that put her back in contact with her experience as a child during the Holocaust. I'm just raising the question of empathy and whether you've thought about it.
Well, I think, Bob, I've really lived with that feeling as a person who's had the experience of a troubled family and recognized that when there is trouble, maybe as Gerda Lerner recognized, that coming together to understand one another's pain and difficulty can provide strength. And I think that I see it in terms of my knowledge of Jewish tradition as where the divine exists. The divine exists between people, and that's why I appreciate the universal tradition, because it's with people that we find the place where God is. And it's that empathy that makes us recognize our humanity. So I see empathy as really what the tradition may call compassion, but empathy is maybe a more psychological approach than a directive. But I'm with Buber in saying the divine is where we find the in-between each other. And that connection between people and the rest of the world needs to be nurtured. And that empathy needs to be extended to all creation, I think. We must extend it to the environment, to the air we breathe, to the earth. We need to find ways to be more empathetic to our surroundings and one another. I think in the lives of these three women, the formative experiences of childhood seem very crucial to what one brings into adulthood. And so empathy for children's experiences are very important too, how children are treated. I think that these women's lives illustrate that what happens when you are a young child stays with you, especially if you are traumatized. And we have the experience of so many children around the world now, the millions, who are being traumatized. So let's not be overwhelmed by it. Let's try to be part of the solution.
I think we have another question from Ruth. I
Well,
lost.
it's more of a comment, and it's on a different level than we've just been talking. But when Sharon asked the question, how important is it to be out as a Jewish person, it reminded me of a couple of instances where I encountered people who had quite radical stereotypes of Jewish people. And this is an experience when I first moved to Buffalo in the 1980s. I had a friend who was a social worker who invited me to meet a Catholic, working class Catholic family in Buffalo. And the people asked me what was my ethnicity. And I said I was Jewish. And they said, how could you be Jewish? Where are your horns?
Oh, God.
And it wasn't mean. I mean, it was like, but it was like, that was what they were told Jewish people had. And so it was very hard for them to believe that I was Jewish, because literally I didn't have horns. And then another experience came from my teaching before I taught at Buffalo, but I taught at a rich kids school, college, and one of the kids, when I said something about being Jewish, he said, "Oh, are you a Jewish American princess?" And I was like, totally floored, because I had grown up working class. But again, there was the stereotype that, all Jewish girls or women were rich. So I felt like it was really important to be out as a kind of Jewish person, because there were all these, stereotypes. And just another example is I adopted a daughter from Vietnam, and she's very Jewish in her identity, but not religious. And people that she meets are constantly shocked that here she is, an Asian kid who's Jewish and, you know, wears Jewish jewelry and claims that, you know, claims that identity. And, you know, it's like, I think it's really important to like make people more aware of the diversity among us as Jews and the, you know, variety of ideas that we hold.
Sharon, I think
Yes.
I think I'm unmuted now. This is Anita. I just have a comment. In addition to the universalist theme, I think we have to be specific. I've been on campuses recently, and I've seen tables full of big meeting rooms with anti-Semitic literature and nothing counteracting this. So I think we have to kind of come up to the plate a little bit and have other literature that tells what Judaism is and why we are and what it means, because we have to counteract this. What are your thinking about this?
Well, I think that's a very good point, Anita. I think that in a way it was anti-Semitism that caused Jews to be silent about who they were. I think that is the fear, you know, that we can be hurt by being a minority and exposing our identities in a hostile environment. But I do think that it requires courage to teach about where Jewish experience is coming from. And I think there is a glaring and deep absence of knowledge about what Jewish history is. And part of that is that in the US, the perception is that through assimilation, Jews have gained a great deal of privilege by being connected to others who are part of the white majority. And so I think that we have to really do what Ruth is suggesting by showing that we have specific values that are not the same as other groups, that we are not separating ourselves from the struggles of other people who experience discrimination. I think we need to bring, for example, Jewish studies programs to campuses that include the universalist messages. Not all Jewish studies programs focus on universalistic messages.
Right.
Not every interpretation of the Torah stresses universalist messages. And I think that more could be done to put as more primary the universalist tradition in Judaism. And I know that even Orthodox rabbis are coming out now to do that, to write about the universal messages in Judaism. The Hartman Institute, for example, in Israel and also here in the States, does a great deal of work in bringing universalism into the heart of Orthodoxy as well.
Thank you.
I know your name's not Jonathan.
Deb, I took a lot of notes and I noticed, Sharon, at one point you mentioned the term tracking, and I can't remember where, but my main efforts to alleviate problems for people, especially children, because I've been an educator for so long, are about tracking and being very anti-tracking. And can you remind me why you mentioned tracking?
Yes, I mentioned it because in the school that Ruth Messenger developed on the Upper West Side, the community workshop school, which she brought about just at the time when there was a great deal of talk in New York City about integrating schools. And the first project tried was busing. And busing was tried initially. And what happened oftentimes is that children of color were bused into what was perceived as white neighborhoods, but they weren't given any supports to accommodate themselves necessarily to this new environment. And they were tracked in classes that were for slower students, essentially. And so it wasn't really integrated schooling at all. And what Ruth Messenger was trying to do in her community workshop school, because the Upper West Side was still not redlined, it was multiracial and people from different economic classes lived there. They formed this integrated school and every class had every group in it. And so it was a non-tracked situation. And it was very, very successful.
So I just want to say that tracking is alive and well in American schools and continuing to do its damage from, 4 or 5 year old up. And by the time the kids are in third grade and behind, they're pretty much their prognosis is not great. So I'm working on a couple of committees on the Cape on that issue. I mean, there were so many issues that one could put their energy into.
Thought I saw a hand. Susie, oh, excuse me, sorry. Sari. You can't unmute?
I can unmute, but my hand was doing something else, I guess. But I might as well say that this is really a very interesting discussion. And I really liked how you framed it at the beginning, with the Jewish values and of social justice values, and then brought it into each of these very interesting women. So there's a lot to think about.
Thank
Very
you.
good.
Somebody just put in the chat box that she ordered the book. I'm hoping people will read more about these women because I really just brushed the surface. And I wanted to say that I am working, as Larry suggested, on promoting the book, mainly because I'm involved in a social justice action myself. I run a workshop for underserved teens on Cape Cod at the Cape Cod Museum of Art. And what that project does is it tries to help underserved teens feel like there is something important to do in their lives. And it does it through the arts to empower these teens. And all the proceeds from this book will be donated to this project called Creative Outlets. And my publisher is helping me with an ebook campaign, which is taking place on March 25th. So if anybody would like to buy an ebook at a very cheap price of 99 cents, could you do it on March 25th? Because on that day, we're hoping that lots of people purchase the ebook of 3 groundbreaking Jewish feminists. And in doing that, the book will receive more recognition. So that's just a suggestion. But also, if you read the book, I would ask if you are inclined, could you possibly include a review on Amazon or in Goodreads after you read it? And if you think it has value to put a review of it, even a short little paragraph about it. That would really help spread the word.
Do we have any other questions? Nancy Stewart?
Yes, can you send, or somebody can send everyone a reminder about that March 25th with a link so that everyone can, and everyone on your mailing list, I'm just sending this out as publicity. They can all go ahead and do it that day. We might crash the site, but that would be great.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Good idea, Nancy. Thank you.
Anyone else or any other comments? It was really wonderful, Sharon. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming and participating. What a wonderful discussion and a wonderful topic. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did.
Thank you, Maxine. If not for you, it wouldn't have happened, really. So thank you so much. I appreciate everybody's comments and thank you for listening.
All right. Good night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Still some comments coming in, so I'm letting them before I close the.
So I will send some greetings to Milton Teichman and Sharon again.
Thank you.
So
Thank
great
you.
to see you here.
Great to see you, Sari.
We're related.
Yes.
You're on mute, Dad. You're talking, but yeah, there you go.
Can you hear me now? Great to see
Yes.
you is what I said.
Same here.
Great to see you, Milton and Sharon.
Thank you very much.
That was very interesting, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I have no idea myself how it came across, so I appreciate the comment.
Really good. And we have the recording. Hopefully it will save properly and I will send it to you.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this now. And good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you, Maxine.
Night.